Cashing in my pocket so my pennies should be. What they selling is cheap, so I'm buying that this freedom is free. I've been becoming me. See when Jesus taking the lead. With purpose I bleed and rise like going under the heat. Defeat is a never. You can't reattach with a sever. What's bringing you pleasure can tell you where you stacking your treasure. When storm is your weather, know that it gets worse for it's better.
Welcome to the Esau Macaulay podcast. I'm your host, Esau Macaulay. On this podcast, we try to take culture seriously as a way of thinking about God. Today on the podcast, we have my good friends, Justin Giboney of the AND campaign and Tish Harrison Warren of her living room. No, I'm just kidding. Tish Harrison Warren,
That's true.
What is your title at your church? Do you have a title? Are you the artist in residence?
I'm the artist in residence, yeah.
Okay, the artist in residence of Emmanuel Church in Austin, Texas. Emmanuel Anglican Church. Forgive me. I should have
Austin,
prepared for this a little bit better.
That's all right.
Yes. What we usually do when we have a theme on the podcast, so we try to ask this question: am I washed? Do you have any ability to actually talk about the theme that is the subject of today? And this is the year-end podcast. We're going to look back over 2024. And so what I did is I went and looked at the top 5 grossing films in 2024. I'm going to see if you've seen any of these, okay? So, matter of fact, do you know what can you guess what the number 1 grossing film of 2024 was? Kids
Barbie?
movie. No, I think that might have been 2023, right?
That was last year. Yeah, that was 2023.
Yeah.
I'm really washed now.
Yeah.
I want to say I listen to your podcast sometime, and I never know the answer to the washed question. So
okay.
I will not get this right.
You got a chance. It's a kids movie.
Oh, Inside Out 2.
Yes, you did it. Look at this. You're in the game. So Inside Out 2 was the number 1 movie.
In the theater.
Look at this. You're at the center of popular culture, Tish. And I'm gonna be honest. I didn't see that one. They could judge me if I want. I've actually seen number 2.
It made me cry. I cried.
I've not seen it
at the animated movie.
Yeah, I've not seen any of the Inside Outs. I don't know. There's only 2 of them, but I've not seen either one of them.
Oh, Esau, go see them. Right now, leave this podcast and go watch.
Okay, I will think about it. The other one is I'm gonna go through the list of them, and you can tell me how many you watched. The next one is Deadpool and Wolverine. That was number 2. Number 3 is Despicable Me 4. Number 4 is Mona 2, and number 5 is Dune 2. So I will confess that I've seen the adult. Actually, I saw Dune 2, Despicable Me 4, Deadpool and Wolverine, but not Inside Out and Mona. So there you go. I don't know. How many have you seen, Justin?
0.
Zero. Okay.
May say more about me being a bad parent than anything else.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm about to say this is like it's really interesting. This was like a kid year. I don't know if that's always the case. So I'm gonna.
First of all, I hate to correct you, but your people will correct you in the comments. So it's Moana, not Mona.
I said Mona.
I'm just saying, I think you really didn't see it. You really didn't see it.
I do know it's Moana. I did know that. That might have just been me butchering it.
You didn't see it, right?
I didn't. No, I didn't see it.
Because literally, I am Moana is like a pretty important part of the movie. Like she's. But I saw Despicable Me 4 in the theater. I'm embarrassed to admit that, but I did. I mean, I have young kids, and we have to do things with them, and I live in a hot place, and so we take them to movies.
I just realized, Moana is set like in Hawaii or somewhere, right?
Yeah.
It's
not in Hawaii. It's in a
alternative.
It's not a real place, but that's the vibe. Yeah.
I just realized there's no black people who are starring in any of the top 5 movies that were released in 2024. Now, quickly, I want to do the music one. And tell me if you streamed any of these people significantly in 2024. I guess everybody knows who was number 1, right?
Taylor Swift.
Taylor, and then The Weeknd.
I'm just gonna stop talking.
Who did you say it was?
Kendrick Lamar.
You said Kendrick? So actually, I looked at this, Justin. I had the most streamed songs of 2024, Kendrick's song was number 29. I couldn't believe that.
Wow.
Yeah, we live in a subculture, bro.
I'm in a bubble, man. I'm in a bubble.
Yeah, I was same thing. I thought so. It was Taylor, The Weeknd, Bad Bunny, and y'all gonna say I'm super washed. I've not heard a Bad Bunny song, and I don't know what Weeknd song is popular this year. I'm completely washed. And then Drake was number 4, and then Billie Eilish was number 5. So I want to let y'all know that we're not in the center of popular culture at all.
Well, okay, so I have a 14-year-old. So when you who uses my Spotify account, so several of the people that you just mentioned, if you looked at my Spotify, I would be very high on, but it is because I have children, the center of the culture. Bad Bunny, we don't let. It's not great. But I'm married to a Puerto Rican, so I have to have like Bad Bunny's Bad Bunny pride.
He's Puerto Rican. I'm going to be honest. Like if Bad Bunny could be walking around and I wouldn't know who he was. So
yeah,
I know. I've heard The Weeknd.
I wouldn't. It's rated R.
So we're not gonna co-sign Bad Bunny for the Esau McCauley podcast. That we're gonna say. Okay.
No, I mean, I don't want to. People have discernment, common sense media. I don't know.
I think that there is this sense that the older that you get, to me, the more this stuff. I try not to be the old dude to get off my lawn, but most of this stuff I don't know. And my son every now and then tries to like play some music for me, and it just leads to me to lecture him about rhyme schemes. So we didn't even talk about hip hop anymore. But he's learning though. He's learning. So what we really actually want to talk about were the top religious stories of 2024 and what they might mean for what the church, God might be having for the church in 2025. And as I was looking back over the year, I said it's probably the main religious story, even though it feels like something of a tired one, is the election and that just took place back in November. And by the time we get this podcast airs, we'll be hurtling towards the inauguration within a week or so. So I don't know if this is too open-ended of a question, but was this something that you learned or were reminded of about the church during the course of this election?
Well, I'll say this. Well, one of the things that the election pointed out to me, which was kind of discouraging, and even from an ad campaign standpoint, was just how partisan everything got, especially when it was already partisan, but especially when Kamala, entered the race, when Vice President Harris got in the race, it became like nobody cared about anything that had to do with bipartisanship. Nothing. Yeah. It was just purely partisan, tribal, which was to be expected. But I think it went even further to where some people who might talk about bipartisanship weren't even really talking about it at that moment. So that was interesting to see.
Were you about to say something, Tish?
I mean, similarly, I don't want to hammer this too much because I recognize there's all kinds of things happening in the church on the ground I don't see. But I mean, yeah, I think I was struck and discouraged somewhat by just how similar the church is to the culture in terms of discourse. And in terms of, I mean, there's just a lot of people who there's really almost no daylight between the, platform of the Republican Party and the Kingdom of God, and I see this just as much, the platform of the Democratic Party and the Kingdom of God. They are equivalent. And, at the time of the election, I was writing a foreword to this collection of writings that's coming out by Stanley Hauerwas. And his whole idea is the church is an alternative polis, an alternative people, an alternative community. And it was such a striking contrast to have this conversation that I was in and part of the church as an alternative community. And then seeing how much the church writ large was not alternative, was really following in the same kind of discourse. Now, I do think there's exceptions. I can think of, the after party had a prayer gathering online the day before the election where people all over the political map prayed together, which I think is a kind of a hint of light in that, obviously, what Justin is doing it. And there's all kinds of exceptions, but I'm saying in terms of mainstream discourse, it was like very reflective of the culture.
I'm going to try my best not to be too ranty, but I found myself
Bring the rant.
more bored around the political discourse in this election than the previous ones. And I want to be clear exactly what I mean. And I'm not speaking about everybody. So if I'm talking about you, I'm not talking about you. But I remember back when at 2016, whenever all of this stuff started, 2016, and there was this whole rush online of Christians who cared about justice and who were trying to say, hey, we're Christians who care about justice. And so we oppose some of the stuff that's happening on the right. And I think that was really important. And that was like the resistance. All of that stuff was an important message in 2016. But then we had basically that same kind of conversation in 2020. And then that same conversation in 2024. And what I mean is, and what was bothering me was not the kind of standing for justice, because I'm like pro-justice. I care about these things. But sometimes I felt like our discourse around issues of justice were the only things we had stuff to say online. And I want to say, like, I have political opinions, but I'm like a Christian, right? Like, I want to hear about Jesus. And I don't want to just hear about how Jesus functions as a resistance to one party, but how Jesus challenges both people or both sides. And when I talk about challenging both sides, I do not mean each side is equally wrong about everything. I'm saying it felt like, okay, I'm not like those Christians on the right. And that was kind of like the whole thing, right? Well, if I were a Christian on the left, it was just self-righteous. Like, of course, we're the people who are the kingdom of God. And what could the Democratic Party possibly have wrong in comparison to the Republicans? And it just felt to me like before I logged on, I could tell you what that account was going to say. And at this point, I was like, yes, there was a need. And I think that I'm not saying this need is any less, like we should talk less about justice. But at a certain point, the gospel itself is a thing that is worthy of our discussion. The pursuit of holiness, pursuit of righteousness. And I felt like political discourse completely swallowed up all religious discourse. And maybe I'm just saying, like, I'm a Christian who has political opinions, but if you're on my social media thread or somewhere, I need to hear some of the Jesus bits too, if that makes any sense to you. That, you know what I'm talking about, Justin?
No, I think it makes complete sense. One of the ways I knew it was going in the opposite direction that I wanted it to is I saw people that I knew in public, like Christian leaders, spitting partisan talking points, like the talking points that you just heard from, like, you know, if you went to a rally or something like that, they were really using those in conversations when they're getting interviewed. And I think what happened this time, and it was worse than I wanted it to be, was we take these surface narratives that the parties and our tribes give us, and we just apply them to everything, and we become incurious about people, right? Yeah. And really what may be going on below the surface. So people don't know. I mean, if you're talking about, a lot of people who are against a Trump, say, may not know the difference between a J.D. Vance and an establishment Republican and what the reform conservatives have been talking about when it comes to economics and all that. They wouldn't know because you don't ask the question. They're just a Republican or just a conservative. And you could see it in how people were talking. They didn't even see the differences and the changes that were happening because they never broke out of those bubbles.
Yeah, and I think that what I wanted to get at is, when I was growing up, and I feel like maybe people are tired of me saying this too, but like when I was growing up, if a shooting happened in my church, we will be marching like we will be doing stuff about police brutality. If there was violence in the neighborhood, we would talk about violence in the neighborhood. But in that same church, I would hear about the need for healthy families. Right. For husbands to love their wives and for dads to be engaged in the lives of their children, for holiness still to matter, right? And so I feel like that sometimes the social witness of the church is only the things that are politically useful for one party or the other.
Yeah, that's right.
And the pursuit of holiness. And I'm not saying I'm not talking about fundamentals, but like Jesus parts, right? And so what I really began to see is that like the reward for simply being merely political and political in the way that the culture wanted us to be political was what I saw happening in this election. And for the most part, I just didn't find a way to engage in it in a way that didn't impress me. Sorry, Tish, you about to say something?
No, I was mostly agreeing with you. I don't I mean, I think a few things. This is phenomenon that you're talking about. Obviously, the church lacks political discipleship. I think part of the reason this was boring is like Donald Trump running again. Like, I didn't write about this election. I've written a lot about past elections. I wrote a tiny bit right at the end. But part of me was sort of like, I think most people have had, like, there's no new information to be had here. Like, we have had this same candidate for a long, long time. No one's like, oh, wait, I didn't know he said immigrants were murderers and rapists. That's new info. Like, it's been out there. So part of it is that. I think part of it is the nature. I'm thinking more and more about how the nature of social media itself, which is, of course, a big driver of the discourse. Even, the mainstream media ends up kind of pinging off of a lot of the conversation of social media. It's good at deconstruction. It's very poor and bad and useless, more or less, for construction, for building something. And so I see things like, I saw something online, and I'm not online much. A family member sent this to me, but it was, someone saying, like, I'm not a storm the Capitol kind of Christian. I'm a love your neighbor kind of Christian, which I'm for. But there's a lot of, I want to quickly pull things out. Like, number one, are those the two options? Number two, to say I'm a love your neighbor kind of Christian. I don't think I could ever say that about myself, in the sense of it seems so self-righteous to me. Like, I am trying to love my neighbor. I want to love my neighbor, but I'm also need to be a constantly repenting Christian for the ways I'm not loving my neighbor. But then also, what if your neighbor is a Trump supporter? What if your neighbor is, obviously, if you're on the right, like, what if your neighbor is a migrant? What if your neighbor is a Haitian? But also, what if your neighbor's like, like a white working class male? Like, what do you? I just think that wading into the complexity of what Jesus has called us to, what you're saying, it absolutely takes apart the right-left categories, because Jesus offends both the right and the left. And again, no one's saying both sides are equal, but we are saying, like, both sides will fall under the judgment of God, and not that neither side is perfectly righteous. But I think more than that, like, to construct a community where the gospel is preached and where we actually love our neighbor is this pretty difficult thing. And I think a lot of times we just we stand in the public square like the Pharisee who said, thank God. What was the story?
I'm not like
a woman. I'm not. And exactly. I'm not like this person. Instead of, like, us actually locating sin inside ourselves and not just in the other political party.
Here, this is probably what I want to say. Maybe I'll say it best and I'll leave it alone. And this is what I realized. For a long time, I had this energy of, like, I want to make sure that people don't understand that I'm not like this particular version of Christianity that I find toxic. But then I realized I can completely distinguish myself from all forms of, like, Trumpian Christian nationalism. I can separate myself from all of that stuff. But there's still elements of the gospel that's offensive. At a certain point, you have to stop doing the work of saying, I'm not like this, to say who you are. And when you say who you are, you're going to realize that people don't like that version of Christianity. There's a thing itself that challenges people, and no matter who you are. And what I wanted to get to again was, like, I get it. You're not like those people, but who are you? And so what I wanted to see in 2025, what I pray to see in 2025, is a church that actually say what it is. And to say what it is, not simply by triangulating itself around these two groups of people, but actually proclaiming the full complexity of God's vision for his preferred future. So that's at least me.
Amen.
So is there anything, maybe I can ask you this, Josh, I know you do this because this is like your actual thing. What do we do if all of the data or most of the data is already out there? We know who Trump is. We have some expectations of the kinds of policies he's going to try to pass. What can a Christian who has been had a high dose of politics going on better a decade, 1620 now to 2025. What can we do if I'm burned out by it, but I'm assuming we're not going to shut down the AND campaign and say we're not going to do about Christianity and politics. What do we do for the weary Christians who have to hear about this stuff again, even though they've been dealing with it for 3 election cycles?
Yeah, so I think it's okay to step away from national politics for a little while, right? Like it's okay to be kind of tired of national electoral politics, but it's not okay to just step away from civics at all, right? Community altogether. And so I would say it's a perfect time to look at local. What can I do locally? What's going on locally? Not only so for those who were disappointed by the outcome, not only can this give you kind of encouragement to say, no, I still do have agency. What I do matters, because it's more direct, right? You can have more direct impact when you're talking about local issues. And then just looking around your community, I guarantee you there's people around you in your community that can benefit from something you have, whether it's your time, whether it's your resources, looking around and seeing where you can get an impact. Because the other side of what we were talking about was, I can't tell you, and I think I called you about this, Esau, like I was hurt, how many people who I thought were more, who would handle themselves differently, were using scare tactics during the election as like their main way to get people to vote for somebody or not vote for somebody. I'm talking about pastors. And I'm like, guys, as Christians, what happens when these people you're scaring to death? What happens when they lose? What are they going to do now? And so I think we need to be thinking about who needs encouragement, who needs to know the world is going to go on, and we probably shouldn't assume the worst before it happens, even if we anticipate some of the things that are going to happen. That's what I would focus on, local, and how can I encourage the people who were told that the world is over if Trump wins or whatever.
Okay, enough election stuff. The other thing that I saw that was interesting was the growing use of artificial intelligence, even in churches. And so I don't know if you paid any attention to this, or even like if you have a working understanding of AI. But let me ask you this. Do you all have it? Do any of your churches use AI at all? Or do you know about whether that church is using it?
I don't know about anybody in my church that's using that.
What do you mean? How can you explain how the churches are
so
using AI?
Some of it I think is non-controversial, like, the creation of images for the church. But the other ones are like they're AI people, the people who use an AI sermon prep.
I did hear about that. I forgot about that. Our church, we barely have like a website. We don't stream. I've gotten myself into trouble that I'm like anti-technology in church, man. I think I have good reasons for it that I'm happy to get into, but I think I'm very skeptical, as you know, about.
The Catholic Church there have been 2 times where not the Catholic Church, where different Catholic organizations have actually had a virtual priest who can hear AI priests who can hear confessions.
No,
I was say something.
The idea of AI sermon prep, like you would AI sermon prep. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The idea that you would really allow AI to do part of your sermon is crazy to me. I mean, I don't know about you. The thing that scares me about this is that I'm not sure, and you guys may know more about this. You guys are theologians. Yeah. I'm not sure AI is powered by the Holy Spirit. I'm not sure what it's powered by. So I'm wondering how somebody gets up in a pulpit like, I'm gonna give you what I just got off the computer.
Yeah, the interesting thing that shows, I think, is what it assumes the sermon is. That it assumes the sermon is primarily a lecture to convey information that you could do like a term paper, as opposed to a pastoral act that grows from meditating deeply on the scriptures and deeply on a particular local community who you know and love. Yeah. Like the AI can't do that, but it assumes that all a sermon is conveying information and not an act of spiritual formation. Right.
Well, I would say there's a couple of things, Justin. I wish that I could be, and we try not to dunk on the church too much on this podcast, because there's no podcast that are critical of churches and pastors. But people are stealing sermons out in these streets. So the idea that they would just make an AI sermon isn't actually crazy. But I think that you're right, that for me, what a sermon is, what a good sermon is truth through personality, rooted in scripture towards particular people. And even for me, like this is like we're planning a church here in Naperville, and I preached my second sermon ever to the congregation. And I'm getting to know the people, you know, from small groups and these other things. And now when I'm writing a sermon, these people are in my head. I say, oh, I can't use this analogy because this might not help in this context. And so because AI just gathers together all the like sermons ever done or whatever, and they kind of gives you, it's by its very nature bland and not particular. And so I do think that it's another stage along the road to kind of dehumanization and one size fits all communication. And sometimes does happen in churches.
So your biggest problem with AI sermons is the homiletics.
Oh no, ethically, I think you get paid to like write sermons. So sorry, like
I'm messing with you.
So no, ethically, hold on. First of all, like I think that like part of your job as the pastor is to sit down with the Word of God and the people before you in prayer and depending upon the Holy Spirit and compose a message. And when people say, and I'm not, forget this, I won't talk about me, but I will talk about when we were progressive. And I would hear people saying about Pastor Charlie Dace, a friend of ours. They would say, man, that was the sermon that I needed to hear. That God used like that particular message on that particular day to bless me. I cannot believe that AI knows what somebody needs to hear on like a Sunday. And so it's literally not human. And so that's probably what I would say is my main issue with it, Justin. So forgive me for just talking about.
I figured that was the case. But when you said it was bland, I was like, well, maybe he's more worried about the style of it won't be enough. Who knows?
No, it's ethical, but it's also the reason it's bland is because it's not rooted in love. I mean, a sermon is an act, like when you're a pastor, theoretically, you should be preaching to the actual, this is one of the reasons I don't love like, sermons on Instagram and stuff, is you should be preaching to the people in the room, not to get, likes or not people outside the room, and knowing their own story. So if you're having all kinds of pastoral conversations where people are struggling with whatever, their greed or marriage, or they're all depressed, like that will shape what you say. And it somewhat comes back, I don't want to make everything political, but it comes back a little to the polarization we're talking about, is that a sermon should encourage people where they need encouragement, but also press people where they need pressing. So if 100% of your people are all fired up about justice, but they don't care about Jesus, like, meeting them in their need for personal holiness, that's like a place to press on. And if your people are all fired up about personal holiness, not cheating on their wife, but don't love their neighbor or the migrant or the poor, or the vulnerable, like that's a place to press on. But you have to know your people and how to press them in a way that AI can't. Besides the fact that a sermon, actually, I mean, Thomas Merton said, if a sermon does not grow out of silence, it is a waste of time. So I don't think that AI is capable of silently meditating on the Word of God. So I'm saying it's a spiritual act for the person who prepares a sermon. I know so many pastors that are way too busy who would be tempted by, it's like Saturday afternoon and their sermon's not still written, like what's AI have to say. But I think who loses there is you lose the encounter with Jesus that sermon's calling.
So
we're saying an AI sermon is sinful. We're going to go ahead and condemn that right now.
No. Listen, sinful, man. So I think that one of the things that happens, and this is actually an important distinction, Justin. Like when people get into these arguments, the first they say, well, is this part of the gospel, right? And then people say, if it's not a part of the gospel, then they kind of push it to the side. That's how we kind of argue. In other words, our theological vision sometimes shrinks things down to its core principles and only focus on those things. And so when you ask, is it sinful, is one question, but is it the best that God has for his people? Right. And so in other words, rather than like my goal as a Christian is to simply avoid sin versus pursue excellence for the glory of God. Now, is God going to
not excellence? It's clearly not excellence.
That's what I mean.
That's why I'm trying to break it down to I'm going to see if you're going to stand on business or not. I'm pushing you.
Is it sinful? Is it sinful? I think if you present something that is not your own as your own, it is sinful. And if you're willing to stand up in front of the congregation and say, AI wrote half of this,
and then you might be sinful, but okay, I feel you.
No, it's not. Like, I'm gonna preach Justin Giboney. Now, listen, you are standing on business. If you say, I'm gonna preach Justin Giboney's sermon, and then you preach it, then, like, you know what? And Justin is cool with it, then he's cool with it. Now, it's even like analogies, right? This is taking it like on the simplest level. Like, you might take an analogy from somebody and say, oh, I heard so-and-so preach it, and I'm going to use it. And I'm going to give credit to where credit is due. You do that for a couple of times, and then you just kind of bring it into your repertoire. So there's certain elements of like, hey, AI, tell me 5 different stories that may involve like this scenario. Like, there are things that you can do that I can imagine that people will do with AI that I'm not going to yell at them about. But I know I was somewhere the other day and someone said, we were talking about something, I don't know what it was, and they said, write an opinion piece in the voice of Esau Macaulay on this topic. And AI produced the opinion piece. In the opinion piece, and maybe I feel like, man, I must be super predictable. Halfway through the piece, it does a Jesus pivot, and he quotes one of the prophets. They quoted Jeremiah, which says, peace where there is no peace. And I was like, that kind of does sound like me. That's a little bit terrifying. But it wasn't me, right? There were parts of it that weren't authentic. And so you could have something like AI write me a sermon that sounds like Charlie Dates or whatever, and you can then edit a little bit and preach it. I think that's a little bit questionable. But the people who are using AI for research, there can be ways where it's no different than Google, right? And so that part, I want to leave space for the limited use for research purposes of AI, which is no different in that regard.
Yeah, I was just talking about straight up sermons, though. Yeah, I was talking about straight up sermons. The scary part of this, to me, though, altogether, the scary part of me, and I'll be quick. The scary part of me to this altogether is that the technology is so far out in front of our ethics. That's kind of why I'm asking these questions. Like, we're trying to figure it out, but it's moving, right? Like, we need time to figure it out, but this thing is moving pretty fast. So that's the scary part to me.
I would say that the simplest principle for me is God called you, not the AI code generator, to preach and lead and pastor your people. Yeah. And I would rather have the inadequacies of my communication because I'm a human than to have someone who could even do it better.
That's right.
One of the things, I have a friend of mine who does, I'm actually bringing him on a podcast. His thing is human enhancement, right? That, like, one of the things that we don't have an ethics for is actually how much human modification we can do. And this may seem like crazy, right? But it's something we're not even thinking about as a church. Like, nobody's going to say, oh, you have a disfiguring injury, you can kind of have, your nose fixed or whatever those things are. And most people aren't going to yell at people who have a little bit of plastic surgery. But now they're able to put chips into people's brains, and there's all these kinds of new technologies. And he thinks that there's going to be a time where the Christians are going to be known as the people who are actually ordinary. That you can, eventually get to the place where we can adapt your gene code to make sure that everybody's 6'5", where you can, and so part of what it actually means to be a Christian is to accept the limitations that we have and not always like modify, but where the line of that is actually not very clear. Like, what's the line between you can do this and you shouldn't do this? And do we even have an ethical frame for that as far as technology around human modification? And I think a similar thing is related to AI. Did you want to say anything else, Tish, before we move on?
No, I think about the sinful thing, I think I think it's very helpful that the Bible doesn't just talk about innocence and guilt. It talks about wisdom and folly. And I would say that most of AI uses for sermons, I'm talking specifically, not generally, is that it falls into folly. Yeah. and if it, I agree with everything Esau just said. I think Hauerwas said, in the future, Christians will be known as the people who have children with disabilities and still have elderly people around, meaning and I hope that's true, But in order to do that, we actually have to be an alternative community. I don't know if we have the political theology now, understanding ourselves. I don't just mean politics there. I mean, understanding the church as an alternative political reality to resist technology, because I think what I see in evangelicalism is we just chase it, and to resist, hey, this would make someone's life easier. This may make someone better. This may make someone have no limits. This may, and those are hard ethical questions, because obviously I'm a big proponent of modern science and the way it can alleviate suffering. But if we try to stamp out all suffering, we end up stamping out those who suffer to try to get rid of suffering oftentimes. So, I do think it can be sinful. I do think it can be sinful to use AI, but good thing we have a Catholic priest Catholic priest you can confess your sin to.
One of the things, I just had like a super dark thought about this. I didn't realize, so if you think about AI, so I'll leave AI alone, but we are going to have to make some real decisions as Christians about the limits of this stuff. Because if AI can already create sermons and lectures and things like in the voice of people, it's probably only a small step where they can do basically electronic versions of people. And you can imagine people having loved ones where they just upload all of the like writings and stuff. And you can have, that's going to be there.
Or hologram preachers.
Yes.
I mean, if I'm in a small town and I don't have that great of preachers around me, if I could get like, I don't know, like big megachurch or whatever, Tim Keller hologram preacher. Tim Keller would not be for that, by the way. Yeah. But to like hologram preacher, why do I have to have this like,
I forgot about these people.
Preacher.
These people tried to get me to sign a contract. I completely forgot about this. About a year ago, some people reached out to me and said they're creating like a AI kind of Bible study. And they were going to get like, they wanted me to answer certain questions. So if you like had a question on the Bible, you could click on it and my recording would come up, right? So we're going to use a recording. But they said, we're going to take that data, but then we're going to extrapolate from it so that if they click on a verse that you haven't talked about, they will make like a fake version of you to answer the question. And I actually said no about that. I completely forgot about that.
What could go
wrong? So basically, like, you wouldn't know if I understood the email correctly. I didn't go too far in it, which was like real Esau recording or fake Esau composited based upon what they think I might say. Anyways, besides that, now that you know that, like, this is the real us, probably. This is not an AI podcast. The last thing that I want to talk about, I think election was important. The use of technology in church is something important in 2024. The last one is this long-term trend that since I've been a churchgoer, which is basically my whole life, there have been more women than men in churches. And one of the consistent pieces of discourse has been, is there a problem? Is there a problem with the race in music? Like, why are there more women than men in the church? And what can we do to bring men back to church? That's been kind of the conversation that kind of peaks and valleys, depending on what's going on in the context. You have these different ways of like, how do you get young men in the church? But there's a recent story that said this year that I think it's Gen Z, that for the first time, there are more men than women who are beginning to attend churches in Gen Z context. First of all, this seems like a strange question. What do you think about this? And is the idea of like gender balance probably in the church a good thing or a bad thing?
Okay. Since I'm the woman, I feel like people are looking at me. But so I want to put this in context. I mean, this is not just a first for our lifetime. This is like a first in much of the history of the church. I mean, when you look at the early church, first, second, third, fourth, fifth centuries, there's always way more women. I mean, one of the early critiques that the church got from the outside culture is that the early church was just slaves and women. I mean, it was that people in power would look down on the early church because of how many enslaved people and how many women were in it, because obviously women found a great place of liberation in Jesus. But you see it almost all through church history. There are some exceptions because we've been on many different countries and cultures for thousands of years. But vast majority, it's always more women. But still on a global scale, the church is far more women than men. So we are talking about this small, weird American phenomenon right now. And that's important to keep in mind. If we took sub-Saharan Africa, your average Christian would, let's take evangelicalism. Your average evangelical in the world right now is going to be a female person of color.
Yes.
Probably from sub-Saharan Africa. Pentecostal leaning. Yeah. So, and young. That's like the picture of your average.
And when you say evangelical, so people understand this, we tend to think of evangelical in the political context in the United States. But outside of the United States, when people hear the word evangelical, they just mean a Christian Protestant who believes that the Bible is the word of God. So just to keep it understanding for the listener, she's not saying your average evangelical in America, or even like the evangelicals who are globally would share American evangelical politics. But evangelical is the word that is used to describe people who believe the scripture is the word of God in the rest of the world. So it's weird when we hear it used that way, but keep going.
Yeah. Yep. Your average evangelical, by this definition, does not care that much about American politics. Probably doesn't follow it, right? So, so I want to keep that in perspective. Now, so that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
That said, it is interesting and weird that this is happening in America. And of course, I'm a female priest. I think it's really important that we have some gender balance in the church.
Maybe that was an unfair way of asking the question. I guess what I think of is, in general, I think that we should have men and women in the church. I think that the spike in male attendance, given the context of what's happening publicly in Christianity right now, is very interesting. In other words, we have Christianity most closely associated publicly with kind of political and cultural power and aggressiveness. And so the question of what kind of version of Christianity people are being drawn to is an important one, because I personally have never measured the health of the thing by how many people are doing it. So, for example, whenever people look back at the history of the church, they often say, the golden age of Protestant Christianity in America is the post-World War II boom, where church attendance was the highest. And so I think the church attendance was the highest. And this is correct, like in the post-World War II. But I don't think that is the golden age of Christianity at all, because that was during Jim Crow. And so I don't care how many people actually go to the church. It's the thing that they are hearing isn't the gospel. And as Christianity has actually, interestingly enough, as church attendance has declined in the United States, you've actually seen, and this is a judgment on the church, the increase in rights for African Americans up until we now back in the 2020, which is a weird thing where you have its own kind of context. But what I'm saying is the decrease in church attendance post-World War II and the rise of civil rights shows me that just because you go to church, that doesn't necessarily mean you're living out like the gospel principles. And just because more men are coming to church now, it doesn't mean that those churches are saying things that are true. It could just mean that they're doing things to draw men in. And so what I'm more interested in is healthy growth than I am simply the growth of one particular demographic within the church and all. But I can't tell why it's happening because I'm not in all these churches.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. Pastor Maurice Watson said something that's, I think, touches on what you're talking about. He said you need to know the difference between growth and swelling isn't necessarily good, right? So you need to know the difference between those two things when it comes to your church. But my first question to you would be, because I'm not all that familiar with the data quite yet, does this actually go across racial lines? Because when I'm in the Black Baptist church, I don't really see it as much. I don't know if it's more like folks going to Orthodox Catholic churches or Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox churches and things like that. So that'd be an interesting question to answer as well. And we may not have the answer now, but that's one of the things I would ask. And then lastly, just looking at the history of it, I always wondered why men weren't at church. And I know in my tradition, even in my household sometimes, like my mom would go to church more than my dad went to church, just what it was. Yeah. And for what I could see just in my environment, part of it seemed like almost an ego thing. And I wonder if ego kind of like, because some guys are like, I don't want to stand on no other guy. You know, he's not perfect. Whatever, you know, reason they might have. I wonder if ego led some brothers out of the church, and now in a way it could be leading them in. I mean, once you're there, God can use you, but it's worth digging into why, you know, folks are leaning back in.
So once again, I grew up in the context of a single mom. So that was my Black church context. And so, and I know that like my story is the story of every Black person in America. So I'm not normalizing in that sense. But I would say that part of what we might be seeing in church are the implications of during that period, during the war on drugs, mass incarceration, the pulling of Black men out of the homes, even during, like, I was actually like, you know, where they had the welfare laws where in order to get the full benefits, the husband couldn't be in the house. And so there was this sense in a Black context where men were separated. And so I'm wondering if
I don't want to put it all in the system, but I hear you.
No.
I think there was some.
What I'm saying is, if you have a lower marriage rate and the mom has the kids, then you're going to see the mom and the kids together in church more. Then I guess maybe you would see, like, maybe, I don't know why, but then you saw the single divorced dad who was in the church. So that's at least my experience. What I saw in our church it was like married couples, right? And single moms with kids. There weren't as many single dads with kids or dads who were divorced who were in church. That was my experience, but that's not that.
That could be part of it. That could be part of it. I'm just saying I also had like uncles, and I would talk to more men that would be like, man, a lot more skeptical of the church. And I mean, so I don't know which one it is. I think they both could play a part in it, but I do think there was kind of, I sometimes saw some ego between a guy who might be in church and the pastor and not trusting him as much as a woman. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. As some of the things I saw, not to say there's no, systemic, reason or factor.
But the thing about it, maybe, sorry, Tish, but the Black part of the conversation, give me about 30 more seconds to talk to Justin about this. I felt like a lot of Black dudes who I knew who were socially conscious, who talked about the Nation of Islam, didn't actually go to the nation meetings either. They were just like on Black consciousness, but they weren't actually always the most engaged. So I had cousins and uncles who were like, I'm going to join the nation, but they wasn't like into the nation. They were just like, they saw these things as a way of affirming Black masculinity from a distance. Mm-hmm. And so that might be what it is. But anyways, I can't call it. Maybe we got to do some more research, Justin. I'm going to do a Google deep dive, and we'll do another podcast of where the Black men are in the church. Unless Tish has a take on that.
So can I talk about the original story?
Go ahead, Tish.
So it's important to keep in mind specifically that, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to speak to the Black part of the conversation for obvious reasons. Because, this is talking about Gen Z or Gen Z, as we call it in my house. But, so these are younger men. So if you take the church writ large, it would still be more in America. It would still be more women because women, as I said, all historically are more religious. This isn't actually even just Christianity. This is just women across the board tend to be more religious. But we're talking about this. It's a generational thing that this is actually younger men and women. So I have a theory based on nothing but my own experience.
What podcasts are for? Give me your hot take, Tish.
But I'm whatever. I'm a pastor. I'm a female. I think there is a pull and a push, like a negative thing here and a positive thing. And I will go for both. I think so with younger women who are doing well by societal standards, by and large. I mean, in America right now, if you are a woman, you are more likely to go to college. You are more likely to be able to have a professional job. Like, we have more women in professions now. They're not the CEOs. So I'm not, like, patriarchy is still alive and well. But I'm just saying, statistically, you're more likely to get a professional job. It may pay less than your male counterparts in the same job. But young men, particularly young men without a college degree, but even young men with college degrees, are falling behind compared to women in their same socioeconomic class. And this has been covered a lot. People have talked about this a lot. This is like a growing phenomenon. So I think on the female side of that, women are experiencing a level of empowerment that past generations haven't. And they see sexism and patriarchy in the church. And that's a real thing. I mean, I have experienced sexism and patriarchy in the church. I have called you to complain about it at times, Esau. And, not from Esau, but from other people.
Thank you for absolving me.
I think so. Some of that is real stuff. They don't see female leaders. They want to see female leaders. They want to imagine themselves and see themselves in the church. So some of it is that. But I also, because I think that the way this was portrayed in the media, a lot of it was like, yeah, who would go to that patriarchal institution? Go women, girl power, get out of the church. I also want to point out, though, that I think historically the church has been a refuge for women, not perfectly, I know, but in terms of being a place where I think, things like being faithful to your wife, not committing adultery, not being abusive, like staying with your spouse. These things are actually very pro-women historically. And so it's been a place that has limited the immorality of men, put curbs on sort of pure or violent patriarchy, and women have found liberation there, right? I mean, that's why the historic church is women. So what I want to say here, this is my curiosity, and this will get people yelling at me. So I'd love y'all's thoughts on this. Maybe I'll put it as a question instead of something. This is what I'm wondering. The church has historically always drawn marginalized people. When you look at in a global perspective, all throughout history, marginalized people who feel like the world isn't working for them are more likely to be drawn into the church. I am wondering, as you see men struggle, like it's hard to the crisis of men that we've talked about in America, not just masculinity, but like there's real data here of like less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to go to college. Men are dying in proportionally way more of deaths of despair. So alcoholism, suicide. So when younger men are growing up in a culture where they're seeing people die of deaths of despair when they don't have a lot of hope for the future, maybe they are feeling marginalized, and maybe they are seeking hope and meaning beyond just like American capitalism and consumerism, because that's not working out for them real well right now. So maybe they're looking for hope. And all the takes I know online are like, no, it's just, patriarchy, and it gives them a place to be patriarchal with their patriarchal friends. And I'm not saying that's not happening places, but it's just curious to me, like, is it possible that young men are feeling vulnerable and marginalized in a way they haven't, and that they're looking for meaning? I mean, what is a death of despair except for a death that comes from a lack of meaning? So people are looking for meaning.
I would say this is a conversation that me and Justin will probably only partially have on this podcast, and we need to kind of wrap up pretty soon. I think it's really hard for men to talk about sometimes how difficult and complicated it is to be a man in America, because it feels like we're complaining from a place of privilege. Mm-hmm. And there is, in some sense, a lack of sympathy for what's happening with young men and the struggles that they have, where they even might say something like, yes, I value women and I want women to thrive and I want women to have a place. But there seems to be not a lot of sympathy for the struggles that men have. And we were talking about this in another conversation, is like there is this sense where men are at risk because if no one shows sympathy to them, anyone who shows sympathy to them gets their attention. And so there are certain versions of Christianity that are tending towards a toxic version, because that's where these men are being affirmed in their insecurities or their needs, or even being spoken to directly about what it actually means to be a man. The conversation that's happening there is not happening in the church. And so I do think what churches need to do is to learn how to allow men to explore what it actually means to be masculine in a context where masculine isn't always something that is negative.
Right.
Is that a fair way of putting it, Justin? Was that too diplomatic?
No, I think that was good. I think you did well. And I'm glad Tish brought this up, because I focused on initially why they might go for the wrong reason. But I do think there's absolutely, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if people were going for that reason, because they need something. Like, that's the right reason to go to church. And I think a lot of young men are going through a lot. But one thing that it shows is, with all the statistics talking about how bad some young men are doing, our society can't change the narrative. Like, we're too cumbersome. Like, we can't shift to like even acknowledge that this might be happening, because we're so stuck on, as I talked about before, these surface narratives that run our society, that these people have this privilege, this person has that, and some of that is true. But we apply it to everything, and we can't change the narrative to even help people who are right in front of us, or feel sorry, have any empathy for them. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
So I guess, how do you say these two sentences, which I think people can't say? Sexism is still real, and it impacts the lived experiences of women. But most statistical measures show that young men are falling behind women in key ways, and that men are struggling with significant amounts of mental health, and they're trapped in seeing that, experiencing that, and then reading accounts that they're the problem in every situation. And sometimes what I've seen some men do, this is what I was trying to get at. The way that they resolve that tension is the closing off of empathy. It's like, okay, like, I know I'm actually going through stuff. You won't acknowledge that I'm going through this, so I'm going to lose all empathy for all discussions of sexism at all. Anytime I hear it, I'm just going to get upset, because I am experiencing my own sense of disillusionment. And what I was trying to get at, what the church needs to be able to do, is to actually have shared empathy for everybody's struggle. That there isn't a zero-sum gain of love, right? That it's only enough love for women, or enough love for men, or enough time to care about women's issues and not about men's issues. And what I would hope we would have kind of coming into 2025 is the church modeling the kind of mutuality that I think is in the gospel. This is the last part that we got to get out of here. The podcast is running long. What I want to do is to end on something positive. So we talked about the news stories for last year. Is there anything positive that's going on locally in your church context, or in your life and in your ministry, that is giving you hope? And I'll start off to give you all a little bit of time to think about what you want to say. I felt like coming into 2024 that there were a lot of people who are disillusioned about the church. I understand there's issues that was going on, but I felt like as people are running from the church, I really felt strongly called by God to run towards the church. And although I'm still teaching at Wheaton College, and I'm still doing things like this podcast, we have begun to plant a church called All Saints Naperville. And just me being around Christians and seeing the sacrifice of lay people who can create this church almost out of nothing, and to see people who want to hear the word of God and want to sing to Him in worship. And so for me, being involved in our local church and in our church plant has really, really encouraged me. And it's been something that I needed to see. I need to see up front the gospel beginning to take root in the lives of particular people. Because a lot of my life for the last 5 years has been traveling around from city to city, state to state. And I felt like I was talking to everybody, but because I was talking to everybody, I wasn't talking to anybody in particular. So for me, my 2024 blessing has been just being able to be involved in a local church and to see God, not me, do so much stuff to help people, even at the very beginning stages. So that's my thing, 2024, happy story. Do you have anything you want to say, Justin or Tish?
Justin, you can go.
Sure. I'll talk to you about this. You know, this year in a lot of ways was disappointing, just in how I think the church responded to things, even aside from the outcome of the election. It was so bad that we had a major event where we were trying to bring Republicans and Democrat Christians together to throw an event right before the election. There was so little interest in anything bipartisan. It just kind of fell apart and we had to cancel it. But what we've been doing now that's really exciting me is we're having the AND campaign is hosting a MLK Day March in Atlanta on January 20th, which is obviously MLK Day, but also the inauguration. And just the response to that so far has been outstanding. And so I'm really looking forward to that. I think this will be a better event than what we were going to do before. I think we were meant to kind of focus in on this and just try to bring people together. So we'll have a program. We'll be bringing Democrats, Republicans, and saying, what can we do together? And I know for me, in a year that's been really tough and really disappointing, that's been encouraging.
So they go to the AND campaign website. They can find out more information about it. They want to join in the march?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's me giving a commercial. I'm always doing that. And also, year-end giving. Listen. If y'all want a better politics, and you want a politics that's rooted in biblical values, that also concerned with the stepped-on and ignored people of the world, close out the year by giving the people of the AND campaign a little bit of a donation. So bless them and bless yourself. That doesn't mean you gotta go expand your territory, though, because we don't talk about that here. Anyways, Tish, you close this out.
I feel bad because mine is so similar to yours, Esau. But Esau and I talk on the phone often, and we have been on very similar kind of journeys here. But, we have this little church plant that we started a year ago, Emmanuel Anglican Church, and it started small, and it started vulnerable in a lot of ways, and it started surprisingly, but it's just been beautiful to see the faithfulness of the people. And it is little, but it's growing. So we kind of doubled in size this year, which means we're still real small. But you get to see so many silent things that people are doing. So you hear, you get on the discourse, and it's like Christians are the worst, and whatever. ACNAs were Anglicans, but then you get to see these people silently giving money to people in need, silently buying Thanksgiving meals for families that lack. There's these quiet movements of God, and you see it most, I think, in the local church. I still think the place of Jesus, God's presence is everywhere. I'm a big fan of, all the parachurch organizations, but the word and the sacrament in the local church, it's happening. And I'll also say there are these little signposts to the kingdom that you see of the AND campaign and our friend Michael Ware's work in trying to create a better discourse around politics, and or all kinds of things, Praxis, and my friends at World Relief that are really trying to protect migrants as we go into this next 2024, which is my biggest concern coming out of the election is migration. And or More Than Welcome, this local Austin organization that works with refugees and migrants here, that all of us, this will not be in the news. This will not be trending on Twitter, but people are doing good work every day for the vulnerable. People are making beauty. People are composing songs, and I'm seeing this. I know these people. And so I feel everything right now that is getting me most jazzed is so small and so local. And I wrote this piece for Christianity Today, Go Slow and Repair Things, but it's all about how these very small acts of repair are what we have right now. But that's what's keeping me going, I think.
Yeah. I guess we will say that the good that is available to us to do is closer to us than we might think. And if I have one prayer and hope for y'all in 2025, that you find some local place you can get about the work of the kingdom. The church is outside. You just got to go outside and meet them. Thank you guys so much for coming on the podcast. I'll talk to you all, the rest of the people who are listening, next week. The Esau McCauley Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Stay Low, Stray Low. If you know, now you know. Edited by Seth Gorvette, like a Corvette. Music by Rob Noor. Make sure to follow the show wherever you get your podcast and leave a review so more people can find it. See you next time. I'm out.
I'm penning these letters with prayers they can aid your endeavors. It's clever benevolence, tasted it, wrestle with, still wrestling. Touch my side and it crushed my pride and told me I'm blessed within. Receive a Christian platitude with gratitude, but in this setting saddest news I live in doesn't add up to the Beatitudes. Catch me in the catacombs, chiefing like they Pat Mahomes. Catching bullets, tackle foes, running plays, defending zones. Field got him doing football numbers, only half is grown. He was acting grown.